All right. So I'm calling tonight's session the role of Jewish studies, education, or advocacy. Uh, Not exactly 100% accurate what I want to talk about, but I wanted to discuss a few different sort of incidents that have taken place, and get your thoughts on them and share my thoughts on them. So I want to start actually with something that happened in the spring and summer of 1996. Okay, and I'm going to venture a guess that some of you may have heard of this incident at the time that it was happening, but have forgotten about it. But I didn't forget about it because it made quite an impression on me at the time. But in the spring of 1996, a fellow by the name of Professor Thomas Bird was appointed the chairman of the Jewish Studies program at Queens College in Queens, New York. It actually is kind of like 2 blocks away from where my dad lived. The appointment of Professor Bird actually became kind of a national controversy. Why? So Professor Bird was an expert in Yiddish literature, and he had been very involved in the Soviet Jewry movement, but he was Roman Catholic. Okay, and so the appointment of a Roman Catholic as chairman of the Jewish Studies program was attacked by some folks, including a previous chair of the Jewish Studies program named Professor Samuel Heilman. Now, I didn't remember that it was Professor Heilman who had actually raised this issue. I was a little surprised because I actually know him, although not well, but I have met him a few times, and I admire his scholarship. He's a sociologist and one of the best scholars of the sociology of American Jewry, and especially of Orthodox Jewry. And Professor Heilman said that it was, scandalous that a non-Jew should be chairman of the Jewish Studies program at Queens College, that there's an aspect of the job that you have to be a role model of Jewish life. He also said that, that Queens College, is a particular type of school, and I mean, this is true. A lot of their students go part-time, and there's a big chunk of the student body who are going to yeshiva, not yeshiva university, but going to a yeshiva and also going to Queens College. And he said that, somebody who wasn't Jewish could not really relate or speak to those people. I want to point out that when you talk about a Jewish studies program, if you look at most universities, it will be called a Jewish studies program, and not a Jewish studies department. Okay, and why is it a program in Jewish studies and not a department of Jewish studies? Because Jewish studies is interdisciplinary, right? I mean, you can't, go to school and get a PhD in Jewish studies, right? And nobody's appointed professor of Jewish studies, right? The Jewish studies program, has people has historians, has people who teach theology or religious studies, people who teach language, usually both Hebrew and Yiddish, people who teach political science, people who teach literature, people who teach art, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. For example, I have a good friend who is the chairman of the Jewish Studies program at the University of Louisville, and he's a professor of English. I mean, his PhD is in English from Notre Dame, not exactly a hotbed of Jewish life, and he's a professor of English. He's not a professor of Jewish studies. Anyway, so Professor Bird was only a chairman of the Jewish Studies program for about 2 weeks, and then he stepped down. He said that he was, being viciously and unfairly attacked, but he didn't see that these attacks would ever stop as long as he was in that position. So he stepped down. He was still a professor at Queens College, but he wasn't chairman of the Jewish Studies program, which was, he kept his position. So the question is, I want to throw it out. I want to hear what people have to say. Do you have to be Jewish to be the head of a Jewish studies program? Why or why not? Yeah, so just hop in.
I don't know, I kind of have mixed feelings about it. I'm thinking of other related things like, would a white person who's qualified be able to be a good head of a Black studies program? Or a white person in charge of Hispanic studies, or maybe even a white person in charge of the African American Museum, even if they are well qualified. So I see the sense that he's qualified, and in that respect, I feel like he would be very good at his job. But at the same time, you can get into this whole thing, like, should any white person play a Jewish person in a play? Should a white person who's darker play an African American person or a Native American person? Or do we have to get a Native American person to play a Native American person? I mean, it gets into this whole thing about, technically, if we're going to say anybody who's qualified can be the head of a Jewish studies program, to me, that then, you do that across the board. So then in that case, anybody should be able to, head another ethnic group or play that part in a movie or whatever kind of thing.
Right. Anybody else?
Well, I just want to point out that Only Theater did a play called The Thanksgiving Play.
Mhm.
And that was actually the whole hypothesis. They land up getting this person who says they happen to be a Native American to represent the Native American. But it turns out this person says, I'm an actress, I can play anybody.
Yeah.
And it sort of devolved from there, but it was an interesting, the commentary.
Anyone else?
They're not exactly teaching, Talmud or like it's.
Right.
I'm sorry, Robert Golden, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that I don't think the Jewish Studies program, like it teaches, history, it teaches thought, it teaches philosophy, but it's not teaching it from a rabbinical point of view anyway. So, like, I don't think that there's a problem really. Like,
Right.
I was thinking, Rabbi Arian, that you know quite a bit about Catholicism. It seems like you would be capable of teaching at some level a course about Catholicism. probably in relation to Judaism, but still, would you feel comfortable?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think anybody was saying that he couldn't teach in the program, right? And I mean, I think Rabbi Goldman's point is well taken, right? That if you have the subject matter expertise, right? And there's a difference. I mean, like one of the greatest professors of academic Talmud in the United States today is at Yale University, Professor Christine Hayes, okay, who's not Jewish. Now, she goes, like when I was in Connecticut, and we had a study day for the rabbis all across Connecticut, and she taught. I mean, she knows Gemara, she can teach Talmud from an academic perspective extremely well, right? I mean, I wouldn't go to her to Paskin a Shaila, right? I mean, that's not right. It's a different approach, and nobody was saying that, you know, he couldn't teach Yiddish, right? I mean, he was an expert in Yiddish, and I mean, he continued in his job as a professor of Yiddish. The specific objection was to chairing the Jewish Studies program. Anybody else want to jump in on this? You know, so I think, I mean, so to more fully answer your question, I mean, I could certainly probably teach an undergraduate, I mean, certainly comparative religion, right? I mean, you know, people who teach comparative religion, you know, generally have their main expertise in one religion, and then they know something about others, right? I mean, I don't know that I'm enough of a subject matter expert to teach like Introduction to Catholicism. But, you know, in principle, there's no reason why a Jew couldn't teach that, right? I mean, the question is, and there are places that do have a Catholic studies program. And you know, I mean, I think Sue's point is interesting, right? I mean, is that you know, would it be acceptable for a white person to be head of the African American Studies program at a university? Would it be acceptable for an Anglo person to be head of the Latino Studies program? For that matter, I mean, would it be acceptable for a straight person to be head of the LGBT studies department, right? And I think, I mean, I would actually say yes. I think that universities are universities, and that people who have the necessary subject matter expertise should be able to hold the position, that the roles of these departments are not to be a role model, not to be, you know, representational. Having said that, I mean, I do think, look, I mean, there are plenty of Jewish professors in pretty much every discipline, right? I mean, you don't find Jewish kids going to colleges and saying, you know, there are no Jewish professors around here. I don't have, right? Whereas you do have Black people going to schools and say there's no Black faculty, right? Latinos, and there's no Latino faculty. Gay, you know, in that sense, I mean, even though we're a minority, we're not necessarily an underrepresented minority in the same way, at least in academia in the United States. So, I mean, but Heilman made precisely that point, that he said, we expect that the head of African American studies to be an African American, et cetera. I mean, this was 1996. There probably were not many departments of LGBT studies around, but so on and so forth. But so I don't agree with Heilman, but I see the point he's making vis-a-vis Black studies, women's studies, et cetera, right? And then there are programs where that kind of representation is considered important. I mean, to me, this is a mind-blowing story, but I don't know how many of you are familiar with the name Julius Lester. Yeah, right. Okay, a couple of you, right? So he passed away a couple of years ago. Also somebody I knew, although not well. And Julius Lester was an African American writer, professor of African American studies at the University of Massachusetts, who converted to Judaism. It was only subsequent to his conversion that he discovered that his grandfather was a German Jew. Although it was his mother's father, so he wasn't halakhically Jewish, but he did have one Jewish grandfather, but he didn't know it at the time that he converted to Judaism. But he converted to Judaism at the time, if you remember, when Andrew Young met with the PLO, when it was still official US policy not to meet with the PLO, and he got fired, and there's a lot of tension. It was one of those periods of tension between African Americans and Jews. And when Julius Lester converted to Judaism, the Department of African American Studies at the University of Massachusetts decided that he was no longer Black, and that he could not be part of that Department of African American Studies anymore. That by converting to Judaism, he had ceased to be Black. And now he was a tenured professor. So, the African American Studies Department kicked him out. So he became a professor of Jewish studies, even though he had no real expertise in the field. But he was a tenured professor, and they had to sort of find a slot for him. Now, I mean, I think that's outrageous that that was allowed to happen, but it was allowed to happen. Okay, so as when I was a Hillel director, and parents would ask me, well, especially at AU, at American University, where there was, there's a fairly sizable program in Jewish studies. And, parents in particular, when their kids were looking at, well, what's the difference between Hillel and Jewish studies, right? But in fact, they're totally different animals, right? I mean, Hillel exists to nurture Jewish identity and Jewish belonging, right? Whereas Jewish studies is to teach about Judaism, right? It should be, as far as I'm concerned, completely indifferent to the question of people's identities, right? It's about the production and transmission of scholarship. And, in pretty much any department, any program of Jewish studies, many of their students, including many PhD students in Jewish studies programs, are not Jewish. I mean, nor should they be, right? I mean, it would be obviously bizarre, I mean, untenable for somebody to be studying to become a rabbi if they weren't Jewish, but to be a PhD in Jewish history or Talmud or Hebrew or whatever, you don't have to be Jewish any more than you have to be, a fish to study marine biology. Right? I mean, it's not about representation. It's about knowledge, right? And I did have an adjunct appointment in the history department at AU because one semester while I was the Hillel director there, Professor Pamela Nadell, who, again, some of you may know, she is a historian. I mean, her appointment is professor of history, but for a long time, she has been at various junctures the chair of the Jewish Studies program. And she was on maternity leave, and so I taught her course. And I can tell you also that talking to friends of mine who teach Jewish studies at a university level, that many of the non-Jewish students that they have are among their best students. And their worst students are inevitably Jewish, right? Because, and I found this entirely true, because what happens is a student is looking for like a fifth course to fill up, their schedule for the semester, and say, oh, introduction to Jew. I went to Sunday school. I know this stuff, right? And they think that they know it, and they don't take it seriously because they think that they know it, but they don't know it, and they think that it's going to be easy, and it's not easy, right? And so so often their worst students are Jewish. Okay, so that's on a university level. And now I want to skip to something different, although we'll get back to universities in a while. But back in January rather of this year, I was going to say December of this year, but we haven't hit December of this year yet. A 26-year-old woman named Jessie Sander filed a lawsuit against Westchester Reformed Temple in Scarsdale, New York. And I mean, the facts of the case are pretty much undisputed. So in the summer of 2021, she was hired as a full-time Hebrew school teacher by Westchester Reform Temple. And she started in July, although I think, classes probably didn't start until September, but the job started in July. And she was working in the job for about 2 weeks when she was called in by the associate rabbi of the shul, who's also the head of the religious school. She was called in by the associate rabbi and the executive director of the shul, and she was fired. And she asked why she was fired, and the executive director said, "We've just decided that it's not a good fit." Okay. Now, so she filed suit under the New York labor relations law. She says that she was filed, the term, I think these are, sometimes with law, you have to use specific legal terms, right? But that, and it's clear. She was fired, rather, because they discovered a blog post that she had written, which was highly critical of Israel, but not only highly critical of Israel, but she said that she is an anti-Zionist. Okay, and it's clear that that's why she was fired. I mean, I don't think that there's any doubt that they fired her because they discovered that blog post that she had written. I mean, we're not talking about something that she had written 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, it was something that she had written about a month or so earlier, right? So we could reasonably, assume that it still represents the views that she held at the time that she was both hired and fired. And she said that that blogging was a recreational activity. And I think by recreational meant that it wasn't like germane to her job, right? It was something that she did, on her own, in her own time. She didn't do it during her working hours. She didn't use synagogue resources for it. It was quote unquote recreational. Further, she said that her job was entirely secular in nature, that it consisted of teaching Hebrew language and developing, quote, social, cultural, and community service programs for teens, right? And that therefore, since she was fired from a secular job for something that she did that was recreational in nature, they had violated New York State labor law, and she wanted to be reinstated into her job and compensated for, the time that she was. And this hasn't even come to trial yet alone been resolved. Okay, so we'll see what happens. Although I can promise you, I know what's going to happen. So the question that I want to throw out before I give you my perspective is, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think will happen? What do you think should happen? Yeah, Sue.
I kind of see a problem on both sides. So I think that the synagogue should have gone through a good selection process if they were interested in people's personal opinions, and maybe had some sort of a discussion or even a list of things that they expect a person to adhere to, and have them sign it, like a contract kind of thing,
Right.
that included, their beliefs or whatever, if that's what they really wanted. And at the same time, I feel like since she was applying for a job in a religious institution, and she knew that her opinions may be questioned by some people, because it's not like she was working at McDonald's. I mean, she was in a religious institution, that perhaps she could have brought it up at the interview as well. Like, is this going to be a problem? I don't agree necessarily with everything that you have, that your congregation stands for. Is that going to be a problem? So I really feel, I mean, I don't know what they'll decide, but I sort of see something left out of both sides.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that they didn't do their due diligence, right? I mean, certainly, I mean, I can tell you that every rabbi Googles themselves every now and then, right? And if you are looking for a new job, you Google yourself frequently, right? Because you want to know what's gonna turn up when people Google you, right? And I mean, it's interesting that they weren't aware of this blog post until after she had already been on the job for a couple of weeks, right? I mean, I think that there may well have been kind of a failure of due diligence on the part of the shul. I think that that's probably accurate. Anyone else have some thoughts? All right, anybody want to predict what's going to happen with this lawsuit? Too bad Alan's not here.
I just know that when you fight for being reinstated, the relationship isn't going to be ever the same. So what's the point? Like, even if she wins the lawsuit, like, if you were fired and you fought in court to be reinstated, you don't trust them, they don't trust you. What's the point, right? Like,
all right, so maybe she's just angling for some money.
yeah, but not,
Yeah.
but there's absolutely no use in her coming back to work, and everything's dandy.
All right, anybody else want to make a prediction about the course of the lawsuit? Okay, here is my prediction. All right, it won't get to trial and she won't get a penny, let alone be reinstated. Okay, it won't get to trial. I mean, I think the synagogue's lawyers are going to make a motion to dismiss, and they're going to win. Okay, and the reason for that is what's known in American law as the ministerial exception. Okay, what is the ministerial exception? The ministerial exception is that a religious organization has the right to decide who is fit to be their minister, right? Like, you can't, in a state, for example, that bars hiring discrimination on the basis of gender, right? You cannot be a woman and sue the Catholic Church for the right to be hired as a priest, right? Because or sue, the Orthodox shul down the road for the right to be hired as a rabbi, right? Because a religious organization has the right to, set their own criteria. Anti-discrimination laws don't apply to hiring of ministers. Okay, now, but you say, well, but she's not a rabbi. She's a 26-year-old, young woman who has a bachelor's degree and spent some time in Israel and knows Hebrew well. But she's not a rabbi. The ministerial exception doesn't apply. Okay, but it does apply, right? Because the religious institution gets to define what means minister, right? Like you probably could not engage in discriminatory behavior hiring a janitor, okay? But if we, so like for us to insist that like the janitor has to be Jewish might not pass muster, right? But for us to insist that a Hebrew school teacher has to be Jewish, absolutely, right? As opposed to, Queens College, right? Where all that matters is whether you know the material, right? I mean, you could know Hebrew quite well and know Jewish history quite well, and so on and so forth, and be perfectly capable from a content perspective of teaching our Sunday school curriculum. But, we would presumably not hire somebody who's not Jewish to teach Sunday school, even if they knew the material. And we have the absolute right to do that. But it's interesting. I mean, this ministerial exception being as broad as it is was settled in 2012 in a case known as Hosanna Tabor versus the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Okay, and it's actually a fascinating case. A woman was teaching at a Lutheran day school, and a Missouri church, Missouri Synod Lutheran, Missouri Church Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is a fairly conservative branch of Lutheranism, and she was teaching both secular and religious studies in this school. And in order for her to be teaching the religious studies part, she had to be a Lutheran, and she had to be called for that job. And she got narcolepsy. Okay, and she took a medical leave of absence. And after about a year, when she had recovered, she went to get her job back, and they said, sorry, we hired a replacement, your job no longer exists, right? So she sued the school for discrimination, essentially under the Americans with Disabilities Act, that she was essentially fired for having narcolepsy, right? And so she sued, and she took the case to the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, and the school fired her for doing that. Okay, now this I found really interesting. Rabbi Goldman will find it interesting. Okay, there's a halachic principle called arkaot shel goyim, right? A Jew is not supposed to sue another Jew in civil court, right? You're supposed to go to a beit din, right? You're supposed to go to a beit din. And now, if you summon the other person to a beit din and they refuse, the beit din can then give you permission to go to a secular court, right? But ab initio, you're not supposed to go to civil court. You're supposed to go to a beit din. Well, the Missouri Synod Lutherans have exactly the same principle, right? That believers don't sue each other in the secular court system. They go to a church tribunal, okay? And by bringing the school to the EEOC rather than a church tribunal, she had violated church doctrine and was being fired for violating church doctrine, okay? And the Supreme Court upheld that by 9-0. By 9-0, okay, including, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sotomayor and Breyer, all upheld that because they said, we don't have to think that it's necessarily fair. But, as I constantly remind my wife, the job of the Supreme Court isn't to decide what's fair or good, it's to decide what's legal, right? And that churches have a legal right to, hire their own ministers, and they decide, like nobody else can say, well, that's not really a ministerial position. So, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, Westchester reform simply has to say, support for Israel is part of our religion, right? And you can't say it's not, because we decide what our religion is, right? So you can't say, well, I can find, 15 rabbis from the Satmar Hasidim who say that support for Israel is not only not part of Judaism, it's contrary to Judaism, right? Well, the Satmar Hasidim don't decide what our beliefs are. We decide what our beliefs are, and that, support for Israel is part of our religion. And, if you don't, if you are essentially rejecting a part of our religion, we don't want you teaching in our Hebrew school, and they're going to win. I have absolutely no doubt that they will win this case under the ministerial exception doctrine. Whether they should or not is a different issue, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is, for better or for worse, a huge percentage of Jews under 30 consider themselves to be either non-Zionist or anti-Zionist, right? And if we are going to write, and they're not, I mean, they're passionately religious in their own way. And I think that, it's maybe not necessarily the wisest thing for them to have fired her. And I think it's probably not the wisest thing necessarily for them, to sort of write people out of the community for their views on Zionism. But whether it's wise or not, in my opinion, it's certainly legal. Okay, and I have zero doubt that Westchester reform will win this case, probably before it even goes to trial. Comments, questions? Yeah, Sue.
I just wonder, does that sort of play into, I've seen a lot of controversy about whether a Catholic hospital has to perform an abortion. Is it that the same kind of, because it's under a Catholic diocese, that their rules would overrun, what you would expect to happen in a hospital? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, not only that, but you had that with, with Obamacare, with the mandate to cover birth control, right? And that also went all the way to the Supreme Court. Little Sisters of the Poor, right? I mean, again, I mean, in the United States may be unique. If it's not unique, it's close to unique, right? But courts give incredible deference to, religious claims, right? But it's a double layer deference, because it's not only that they give deference to religious claims, they give deference to claims that this is a religious claim. You know what I mean? In other words, I mean, that's what's called excessive entanglement, right? In other words, a court will not decide whether a religious claim is legitimate or not according to the doctrine of that religion. Okay, they won't, right? They may examine whether it's sincere, right? In other words, if you make a religious claim, my religion forbids paying taxes, right? they might question your sincerity, right? But they're not, but if you say, my religion is Lebowitzism, right? And it teach, right? They're not going to bring in an expert on the history of Lebowitzism to say, no, right? In other words, that the point, right? They will not examine whether a religion legitimately teaches what you claim it does. All right, that's called excessive entanglement, right? So, as long as a belief is sincerely held, right, it's going to have tremendous level of deference, right? I mean, not 100%. I mean, we see this with vaccine mandates, right? Where different courts have held differently. Like they say, you may have a legitimate religious objection to being vaccinated, but the public welfare overrides that, right? That the state has an overriding interest in public welfare, right? Similarly, like Jehovah's Witnesses, right? An adult Jehovah's Witness can refuse, right? Or an adult Christian Scientist can refuse treatment, right? But if it's a kid, the court is gonna override parental wishes and require treatment, et cetera, right? But I mean, the United States may well be unique in the level of deference it gives to religious claims, but it definitely does, right? So I mean, when I read this, again, I am not sure how I feel about the wisdom of what they did. And to your point, I think is very well taken that somebody might well have been asleep at the switch when they hired her in the first place. But the legal question to me is incontestable that they have the legal right to fire her, and I don't believe it will get to trial. All right, so now let's move on to the recent case at the University of Washington. Okay, and now this is a really interesting case because it is quite current, and it's read, different people have different kind of perspectives on what exactly happened and its meaning. Is that all right? So here is the fact. Okay. The University of Washington returned $5 million to a donor who was unhappy with the views expressed by the chair of its Israel Studies program, whose her position, and other aspects of the program were funded by the gift. Okay, so the person, her name is Becky Ben Arroyo. She's Sephardic. Actually, Seattle has a very large Sephardic community. She made a $5 million gift to the University of Washington to establish a program in Israel Studies. The holder of the Becky Ben Arroyo Endowed Chair in Israel Studies, who is the chair of the program, signed an open letter in the spring, highly critical of Israel's actions in Gaza. Ms. Benaroya was not happy about it. She let the university know that she was not happy about it. And eventually they decided to give her back her $5 million, right? I mean, these are like facts. Other things are not so clear, right? In other words, it appears that she wanted the university to put new conditions on the endowment, that the professor was not allowed to sign statements that Ms. Benaroya considered to be anti-Israel. There was negotiation back and forth, and eventually the university decided, you know what, here, take your $5 million back. Okay, now, and hundreds of Jewish studies professors signed a statement, critical of what the University of Washington did, and thousands of professors in all different departments accused the University of Washington of undermining academic freedom. Okay, although the university says that far from undermining academic freedom, they did what they did to preserve academic freedom. In other words, they didn't want to fire the professor, and they didn't want to limit the professor's freedom of speech, and that rather than accede to the donor's demands, they just gave her back her money. The academic establishment pretty much says, but you shouldn't have done that either, right? I mean, there are, you cannot let a donor, right? In other words, if somebody wants to donate money to a university for an endowed chair or endowed program, and they say, here's $5 million to establish a chair in anything, all right? A chair in marine biology, okay? But I get to pick the professor, right? University is supposed to say no, right? University is supposed to say no. For a donor to dictate, who is hired with their money or the political direction, so on and so forth, that's not supposed to happen, right? They're saying, rather than allow that to happen, we just gave her back her money. We only gave back the original gift, right? We still have $6 million left that the endowment, produced since it was originally given. The professor's not fired, she keeps it, so on and so forth. So it's a little bit controversial as to how to read the significance of what the university did. But from my perspective, and I have to say that, I looked at the statement that she signed, and you always look at if you read an article that says it was an anti-Israel statement, I don't think it was an anti-Israel statement. I think it was a statement that was critical of Israel. I would not have signed it, all right? I probably 80% agree with it, but not 100%. I have my own questions about the utility of signing such statements, but I think that academic freedom, I mean, it's not sacrosanct. I mean, certainly people have been fired for, Holocaust denial, right? Professors have been fired for Holocaust denial. They've been fired for, racism and sexism and so on. So it's not 100% sacrosanct. But I think that, I mean, I think to let a donor dictate those kind of terms is not helpful. But the university would come back and say, yeah, but, we want to be able to still raise money, right? And that this is probably the least bad course of action. I'm not really sure, but but I think it's like the Westchester reform and the University of Washington are clearly different from my perspective, even though essentially that the claims made about the two people are fairly identical, right? But if you're teaching at a shul, the shul absolutely has the right to dictate what you say, how you express your beliefs, fire you for what you believe if they discover it. Whereas I think a university, and certainly a public university, absolutely does not. I think they're two, radically different situations. Again, questions, comments? Anyone? All right.
Yeah, sure, Rabbi.
Yeah. All right. So good night, everybody. Shabbat shalom. Thanks for joining.
Good night. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Night.
Good
Night.
night.